I'm going to fly like an eagle into the future, except that we're actually going to be talking about rigid airships that were flying like an eagle in the past. This is a horrible introduction for It Belongs in a Museum. I, of course, am Andy, joined by Mark once again.
Hello.
Today, we're going to be talking about the United States naval attempts to create a Zeppelin-based naval fleet
Uh,
and the insane internal strife and sabotage that caused basically the state of the Navy as we knew it by the time it finally reached the World Wars.
okay, so what era are we in at this point? At the
Well,
start?
the 1920s is where we will begin.
Oh, so we're like,
If this had released 15 years ago, the steampunk fans would be going wild right now. So before we get further, we're going to need to distinguish a few specific facts, namely the difference between a blimp, a rigid airship, and a semi-rigid airship. So, a blimp is a non-rigid airship. Its shape is maintained by the pressure of the helium or hydrogen gases inside of it, like a balloon. It deflates like a balloon anytime it has a large puncture, which is not good. They are smaller than rigid airships in general, and they're mostly just used for short range or even for advertising by Goodyear, which is kind of how we curtail into the Golden Sahara episode where Goodyear designed those tires. Goodyear designed most of the materials used on all of these rigid airships
huh,
because they also helped design the canvas outer layer for the German Zeppelins of World War One.
such a weird history that company has had.
It really is. A rigid airship, also known as a Zeppelin, and Zeppelin is a German dirigible airship, and dirigible simply means it's a steerable or guided solid shape in the sky.
Okay.
So there's a lot of words that I felt people may not know. So dirigible means you can steer it. Uh, a German dirigible is a Zeppelin, and that's where like Led Zeppelin and all that. That's where it comes from. It has a solid internal framework, largely made of aluminum, is what you'll see made, and then a couple other alloys in the future. And then there's also the semi-rigid airships, which had minor structure but primarily relied on gas for its shape, such as the Norge or the Norg. I'm not sure how it's pronounced.
I believe it's the Noid, and it was a part of Domino's advertising.
That flew over the North Pole and led an exploratory controversy around the polar ice caps, leading to mysterious deaths and disappearances. But that's not the episode we're talking about
Well,
today,
why not? That's awesome.
uh, because this was how I was preparing for the topic I had already chosen. We can
I,
circle back to this
I
in a
dem
future
I
episode.
demand a part two.
Okay.
You
So
can't be like, oh, airship that caused missing in the North Pole.
let's start with the USS Shenandoah.
Let's do that.
It was the first rigid airship built by the Americans. It was based on the German Zeppelin designs of World War One. It was originally built in 1923 and given the sort of nomenclature of ZR-1. It was also the first airship to cross the United States of America. The Navy largely flew it around for recruitment. You fly it around, people see a big Navy logo in the sky, and they think, well, gee golly, I'd like to be in the sky.
I mean, yeah, that is the response everyone has when they see one of those things is, I want to be in that.
And you'll know, just because you know me personally, I'm a big fan of Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow.
It's a great movie.
So this whole episode kind of just makes me think of the Angelina Jolie fleet.
Yeah.
Um, the Shenandoah was 680 feet long and was powered by six Packard gas engines. The early design proved to be too rigid, and when it got stuck in a bad storm flying over Ohio, the storm broke her into three separate parts as it crashed down to the earth. Locals scavenged the bits to keep, and to this day, there's still like bits of framework and canvas that are coming into like museums. In fact, some people cut enough canvas from the downed uh, rigid airship that they were making raincoats out of the fabric of it, the
Dude,
canvas.
I would love a coat made out of airship
It's
material.
pretty cool, right?
That is,
Well, and this is right.
it's an aesthetic, and I don't know what the name of that aesthetic would be.
This is going into the Great Depression era, so you're thinking like there's some poverty already starting to show up, and these people are like, "This is a
Oh.
great jacket."
Dude, so yeah, well, now we know what would happen if aliens crash landed.
Yeah, we'd be making jackets out of their stuff for sure. Um, so now we get into World War One.
So, my brain is still reeling from the
Yeah, we've already gone polar ice cap controversy as a
yeah,
lead up, and
and
then
the
the
fact that it's
fashion
like,
industry of
oh,
Ohio.
poverty is so bad. We tore apart an airship. It's such a dated sentence, but in a very specific kind of beautiful way.
So, after World War One, Germany was forced to make a Zeppelin for America as an apology for being a bunch of poo poo doo doo heads.
This is because of World War One that they're making this.
Yes, the Treaty of Versailles limited German manufacturing but allowed them to make one lighter than aircraft as war reparations for America. This became the LZ-126, aka the USS Los Angeles. It was better built than the Shenandoah due to far more practiced German engineers who'd been basically making these throughout all World War One, and something that will come into factor about 3 episodes from now if we follow the topic schedule that we have planned out. At this point, prior to World War One, Germany is like the toy manufacturer in the world. And then these toy factories, like cute, adorable little like villages that were like little men carved like wooden toys and stuff, and like
Yeah,
little tin toys,
the Santa
become
Claus, like
yeah, they become war machines instead. They start designing like things for the military. It becomes an industrial complex, which leads to Japan becoming the premier toy manufacturer while World War One happens.
wait, isn't that the premise of the Robin Williams movie Toys?
Is that the one where John Cusack's sister is a robot?
Yes.
It's such a weird movie.
Yeah, but it's like we make toys. Oh, now we're making weapons. But they're like
Who's the
still.
villain of that one?
I cannot remember.
I'll put a picture of him up in the video. Anyway, yeah, so the USS Los Angeles, which by the way, I understand that the USS Enterprise was called the USS because it was based on like airships and stuff.
Hmm.
But it still tickles my brain because as a kid I watched Star Trek and I didn't know about airships. So reading USS Shenandoah and Los Angeles, it feels kind of fun.
Yeah,
Um, it was 656 feet long, made of duralumin, which is a aluminum copper alloy combination.
that would go for some pretty money now.
It was powered by five Maybach VL2 engines separated into five distinct nacelles. And a nacelle, by the way, I thought that was just the term of the glowy bits on the Starship Enterprise.
Oh yeah.
It's actually like if you're on a plane and you see like the streamlined shape that has the engine, or maybe it would have fuel or something, and anything that is streamlined and outcropping part of that is a nacelle,
So anything that juts out from the main body.
according to what I found out.
Ah,
It's kind of interesting. So,
Star Trek was teaching us when we didn't know it.
I know. The USS Los Angeles used hydrogen, but eventually switched to helium because it was less flammable and safer. Once, to prove how rad it was, it landed on the U.S. naval carrier USS Saratoga in 1928. Like it docked down with an active like ship in the ocean to like exchange stuff and then leave again. It wasn't really a military vessel. It was mostly a test bed for the Americans to learn how to build their own things and what technologies they could do.
Okay, so that okay, because I was trying to figure out like why an airship? Why would you want that? But it's like we asked,
Because we were bad at it.
we wanted the Germans to make us a thing that we could reverse engineer.
Hmm. It was the most successful rigid airship of all time, serving from 1924 to 1932 without any major incidents at all. Between World War One and World War Two, Japan had become very advanced. They had once been an isolationist nation, but had
Yeah.
quickly developed technologies. And one of the technologies they developed was an insane naval fleet. In fact, I believe it was more than 30% of their national budget annually was going to beefing up their naval presence. And that means that the Philippines and other American interests were now in trouble. And not only that, but they could cross the Pacific and they could get to America.
Right, because like the map, like Pac-Man,
Mhm.
circles back around.
And so a big issue was that essentially people knew that war was coming for years, and it was just when will it go, and
Yeah,
what side will everyone be on?
that was something that people brought up. It's like, man, could you imagine if Hitler hadn't been born? If you stopped, it's like World War II still would have
It would have
happened.
just been different
Yeah, it
slightly.
would have been different people.
The Japanese naval fleet was too numerous to guard against, and America's naval fleet was too small, too slow, and too thin to guard the entire Pacific Ocean. Like, it just didn't have enough places where you could have people making sure that these ships weren't slipping through. Too many holes in the net. So Rear Admiral William A. Moffett, also known as the father of naval aviation, hatched a plan to counter the rising Imperial Army quickly and cost effectively.
I assume it was airships.
Yes.
Because if your thing was like sea mines, we're changing topics.
So his plan was he wanted to prove with the Los Angeles it was so effective. Why don't we make a fleet of airships because they're faster than a naval carrier and they
Yeah.
can go further than a naval carrier and they can just radio back whenever there's danger. They're literally just scouts.
I I don't know what the knowledge was of meteorological stuff. I assume it was similar or comparable to what we have now.
I mean, obviously they didn't have
Like real,
Bill Paxton hadn't put all those weird spinny bottle things inside the tornado from Twisters
yeah,
yet.
but I feel like making lighter than air vessels and putting them over tropic waters could end very poorly.
So, these Combat Scout naval airships would be the largest airships ever made.
Oh,
They were 785 feet long, or 3 football fields.
okay.
The top speeds of 80 miles per hour, powered by 8 Maybach VL2 engines. So they've upped the number from the Los Angeles. It could carry up to 100 crew members for as long as a week. They were armed with machine gun turrets and up to 5 Sparrowhawk biplanes to scout and fight. They,
So these things had planes attached to them.
yes, that would be deployed and then re-anchored using a trapeze system, which, would you like to know about the man on the flying trapeze?
Sure.
So the planes were kept in a tiny dock inside of the bottom of this airship.
Like Indiana Jones
And
showed.
these ships that were being made, first was the Akron, and then the Macon was made, which is a real tongue twister when you're researching late at night. And basically, all these planes would be kept on a hook attached to I've sent you some images that you can look
Yes.
at. They would be kept up on like a hook system, and they had a sky hook on top of their fuselage. The trapeze arm would then be lowered from the airship. The pilot would start the engine, and the plane would drop into free fall as it spun up and then flew away.
Which is crazy.
It's basically the vertibirds from Fallout, but way less technologically advanced, even for 1950s type stuff, because this is a good 30 years before that, even in the fictional world. And in order to come back, they would fly up and they would hook their sort of sky hook. It kind of just looked like a big metal circle on top of their plane, and they would line it up, match the speed and vector of the airship, and then hook themselves onto a hook where they would then
Oh.
be winched back up into the airship hangar and the pilot would get out. The Navy had vague ideas of how to handle the rigid airships from the Los Angeles, but really they had no idea what they were doing, and none of the Navy men who were trained to be on naval ships knew how to fly big floating bags of air.
Did no one think to talk to Germany and hire some people?
We were not in the best of terms with them, but no, they did not.
I don't know. Have someone infiltrate their toy manufacturer.
So, the Akron and the Macon had mess halls, crew quarters, control rooms, engine rooms, a rear radio room, and the back wing to scan for enemy radio transmissions. This is before like radar and sonar are really much of a thing or effective at all. So the idea was that as soon as one of these airships would see an enemy fleet, they would radio the Navy ships to intervene. So like they're way further out.
Mm-hmm.
They know this, so that way the other Navy ships can vector in and block off what's happening. And ideally, they don't see any combat. They don't see any combat at all. But since it is a rigid airship, they actually don't hold their form with gas, so you can puncture it, and because it's not super pressurized, it doesn't leak and immediately drop. In fact, there was a British rigid airship that lost, I would say 25 to 30% of its front nose was caved in, and it flew for another like hour or so to land safely.
Which has to be a tense flight for
Yeah, it
everyone
was very
aboard.
tense.
Like we're missing a fifth of our balloon. But it's give us 45 minutes and we'll figure something out.
If you look out the left window, you'll see the rest of our Zeppelin.
Oh, right.
The Goodyear specialized canvas and special helium would make the rigid airship stronger and safer than the German Zeppelins of World War One had been.
We should get Goodyear as a sponsor.
At this point, yeah. On August 8th, 1931, at the Goodyear Air Dock, crowds came in to see the Akron, which was completely finished, and the nearly completed sister ship, the Macon, as Moffett was pushing for an entire fleet of these things. People were a little bit like, I don't know though. And it didn't get better because in 1932, politicians arrived and they're like, take us up on your airship, show us what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately,
Of course. I was waiting
uh,
for the heel turn.
a windstorm picked up and dragged the entire rigid airship around its anchor point, damaging the real tail rudder to the point that the news and the politicians basically spent the rest of the year just saying they would never get on a rigid airship again. It's a waste of taxpayer money. It's not the future of the Navy. It's a death trap. And you have to
I
understand,
mean, they lived.
making
I,
national news at this point in time, like you
yeah,
hear about something happening on the other side of America and it's blowing your mind. So it's a different world. You have to really contextualize that culture was different. Like people, you had to cook every meal. People spent way less time just watching TV because you couldn't,
yeah,
not because
and
they didn't
the
want to.
the channels weren't on all the
Yeah.
time.
So, on a later exercise in California, the heat had increased the temperature of the lifting gas,
Uh,
and it couldn't land because it had grown too hot. It basically became too effective of a rigid airship. It couldn't go down. They tried to as ground crews grabbed the anchor ropes and held it in place, but wind pulled the Acorn up along with three men still holding on to the ropes.
yeah, I think
You have an image of that, yeah.
yeah, I saw that image and I was like, what am I looking at? That airship looks so small. And I was like, oh no.
Crowds were terrified as they filmed and photographed three men rising higher and higher until two fell to their deaths and one was later rescued. Bud Cowart and Herb Ware fell to their deaths, while Richard Deal held on until the Acorn finally cooled off enough to be lowered, and came off of the rope at a safe distance and was fine.
That has to be
Horrifying.
the most terrifying experience I
I
could possibly imagine.
I
Like,
bet he was exhausted from being clenched the entire time he was holding on. Like every muscle in his body would have been
I
rigid.
imagine the adrenaline probably helped, but
Oh, but once it wears off,
oh,
it's game over.
I bet that guy was also going around telling people that he's
This
never getting on a rigid airship.
This made national news and
Of
sullied
course.
the rigid airship concept even further, despite the fact that this was largely due to untrained crews and not the rigid airship design having inherent design faults. It's really just
Yeah,
they don't know how to use this.
what I'm learning is that it's like they just lacked information on like, hey, what do you do in heat situations? Or what do you do when there's a storm and you're still tethered to the thing? Like,
Well,
these all seem like design issues that like could be solved theoretically.
so in 1933, in April the 3rd, Rear Admiral Moffett had he had some ideas. He said he was going to go out for a routine training session when the Acorn encountered a storm over the water.
Ah,
He was like, you know what? Everyone says our ships can't cut it, but we've seen the science. We know how this was engineered. We know these things can survive a storm. We just have to push through the storm. So he ordered his men to set his engines to full impulse. I'm using Star Trek terms because it's fun, and power through what he assumed was a very small storm.
I don't like how you said what he thought was a very small storm. Because like, if the next thing is like, and he was right.
Hours went on, and instead of just a small storm passing, it grew stronger, and history would later discover that it was the strongest storm New Jersey had had in over a decade.
Like, this is, I'm like, we've seen so many sci-fi and like things where it's like, oh, that thing's deadly. Like, notably, what my brain keeps going to the Lost in Space movie from like
1998, I want to say.
yeah, the where it's like, oh, the star's gravity is pushing, like, is pulling too hard. Go turn around hyperspace through the star's gravity.
Yeah, I
Like
mean,
that's what this guy's doing, except there was no gravity. He's
uh,
just like he just had
he had something to prove.
yeah, and which is it. I've watched enough movies to know that is the most dangerous type of leader in the world, is the guy who has something to prove.
Of the 76 crew, 73 died
You don't how
as the Akron crashed into the ocean. Would you like to
um
guess why?
the storm?
Well, that's kind of a cheap guess, but
Did they get struck by lightning?
not because it broke, not because of waves or lightning, but because the altitude sensors were confused by storm pressure and read as being that they were higher than they really were, which caused a gust to push their tail into the water, and then the whole thing got sucked into the water.
That
Moffat
wasn't that.
died during this event. 2 weeks after this crash, the Macon was completed and ready to sail,
Oh, okay.
which is not a great time for your next project to be ready.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you lost the guy who was, being like, no, into the storm.
This is where I like to say the real Sky Captain enters the story.
Oh,
In place of Moffat, Captain Herbert Wiley took over as the leader of the now singular United States Airship Armada, after having served on all prior airships and even surviving the crash of the USS Akron.
oh. So this we've got, you know, Captain Jean-Luc Picard.
He would leave a legacy, sort of flashing forward here, he would leave a legacy of safety, refinement of procedure, calm under pressure attitude, and the biggest balls in airship history.
I love this guy already.
When
Which
one,
the fact that like, oh, he was on a whole bunch of airships, and my brain was made like, well, not the one that crashed, and including the one that crashed.
and 2 weeks later, he's like, I'm ready
So
again.
wait, the Moffat guy,
Dead.
he was considered the like grandfather.
Of aviation.
So is this guy the wet nurse of aviation?
I think that had the airship program gone on further, he would be sort of like the Neil Armstrong of airships. He would be the guy. He's like the Top Gun Maverick of airships.
Oh, a much slower burn movie.
Yes. When Wiley took over the airship program, it was a tragic laughingstock that struggled to succeed in the press, with politicians, and even in Navy drills, because the Navy drills at this point were basically rigged to make the airships fail over and over again, because the Navy now wanted to scuttle the entire program.
Ah, so like
But
the
this one group who was still part of this remaining airship did not want that.
I want this movie so bad.
You haven't even heard the most daring elements are not even on the page yet.
What? Continue.
Wiley changed the way the airships worked. Instead of scouting with let me see, my handwriting got kind of bad when I was writing.
You better tell me
Instead of
right now.
scouting with the airship and having planes simply circle to defend, he created a vector-based flight plan so that planes could be dropped off and they would scout while the airship remained further away from potential enemies and hidden inside of cloud cover, so that the small planes were the only chance the enemies would ever have to see. They were much faster, much smaller, much harder to see.
So the logical thing to do.
Yes. And since there was no real use of like radar or anything, line of sight was really how they found their way back and how they would both be seen by the enemy and see the
Yeah,
enemy.
the needle in the haystack that I was mentioning.
He also improved the Sparrowhawk designs by removing the landing gear, since they're always over water, and instead
Oh
replacing
yeah.
it with added fuel tanks that
Oh.
were aerodynamically shaped, which improved its max distance, and he then improved the line of sight navigation systems inside of it.
Granted, I think the worst case scenario if you're flying that thing is like, hey, we can't find the Zeppelin, we're thrown off course or
Well,
whatever.
that's why he came up with a mathematical equation of you fly for this long at this speed at this vector, and then you turn this vector back, and that will
Oh,
mathematically
so
catch back up with
it
us.
was a mathematical
Yes.
map system,
He used math
which
and angle algorithms to create a flight plan.
which is the thing that pilots are told is like trust your instruments, trust the math, trust like don't get disoriented, trust the system.
So that's interesting to say that because that will come up later. However, the Navy was still rigging tests by having the airships navigate crowded oceans full of enemy planes and ships, which isn't what this was meant for. This was meant to be in barren stretches of the Pacific Ocean, looking for that needle in the haystack, not in a super crowded area where it has to pass stealthily through
Yeah,
areas.
it's not even the right job.
Exactly. Um,
Like if you're
when Wiley asked the Navy to maybe play fair and actually test it for what it's meant for, the Navy said no. So Wiley got creative.
oh
If you can't impress the brass, well, you should impress their boss.
oh
Who's the boss of the Navy?
president?
While President FDR was traveling on a naval carrier, he was visiting other nations. However, the last leg of his trip would put him in open waters where he could be killed. So the ship would go radio silent so no one would know the route it was taking to get back to
Yeah,
America.
which apparently is standard issue for, you know, like ships at the time is that you go radio silent when the president's on board.
Yeah. So since spotting hidden ships in the Pacific is what the Macon was built for, Wiley got a
Oh.
plan. Wiley signed the ship out for a regular training trip, but actually went out to sea to find the hidden president.
The fact is, like, we're going out to find the president where he's currently at.
In less than 24 hours, Wiley's scout planes found the USS Houston. Wiley called the ship over the radio and said, "Why don't you go ahead and look up?" The president was shocked to see two Sparrowhawks flying overhead, dropping off the morning's newspaper from America and several American magazines to read to pass his time that had just come out that morning.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I'm going to have to really dial your laughing down on that.
Sorry. And the thing is, when we were doing the test audio, you're like, that's how loud you're going to be, right? And I was like, yes.
The 1,200-mile mail delivery had wowed the president and the press, but not the Navy. The Navy the military in general, does not like it when you say you will do one thing, and instead you go somewhere else and do something else with their equipment. However, FDR's love for the stunt saved Wiley and the Macon from the Navy's wrath. While Wiley made the crew more adept in the air, extended flight capabilities, and improved nearly every system and procedure several times over, the Navy held a grudge for his stunt and wanted the rigid airship program gone for good. But they just couldn't sink him. Like they couldn't do anything to him punitively.
Yet
So they
again,
used the government's greatest superpower
bureaucracy.
and incompetence.
Uh,
As a result, the Navy refused to fix the rear upper fin for over a year, which they discovered had a design flaw. It had actually been welded in the wrong place. Originally, it was supposed to be further up on the rib cage of the internal structure, and it had a very good chance of failing if they didn't fix it. However, the Navy kept saying, well, you guys could fly out and find the president. You don't need it fixed. The flaw could have been easily fixed, effectively, quickly, and cheaply, but the Navy always has an excuse to delay repairs or outright deny them.
this is like that movie about the Bradley that had Kelsey Grammer in it.
Very funny movie.
It's not funny. It's
Well-
stressful. It's accurate.
Funny and a serendipity with John Cusack. Wait, this is two John Cusack references in a single. Was that John Cusack?
Yeah, serendipity. Yeah.
And Kate Beckinsale.
Yes.
Wow,
I
out of
ver-
his league.
I very much do not like that movie.
It's wonderful.
It's stressful.
Like the testing and drills, the airship was being set up to fail by the Navy once again. Wiley had been preparing, because at this point he's like, we're really good. Like he's dialed everyone into a T. The crew is finally properly trained. But the Navy didn't want to repair anything because they wanted to dissuade any more cunning stunts from the group. However, in February of 1935, the Macon was coming back from a successful scouting trip, proving that once again they are very effective, when a storm rolled in. The strong wind ripped the unrepaired upper wing off of the airship and left the airship adrift in the storm for over an hour because it could no longer control the direction it was going. Now, the instruments are still saying they're high enough, but Wiley already knows the instruments aren't always correct.
Yeah.
Knowing the danger that the Akron had had in a similar scenario, Wiley ordered the crew to prepare to land in the ocean. The crew members were given ample time to put on flotation devices, radio for recovery, and to move to safe positions as they neared the ocean. Because of Wiley's safety focused leadership, of the 83 crew on board at the time, only two were lost in the oceanic crash and while waiting for recovery at sea during a storm. The Macon and all of the custom built fighters sank beyond recovery into the ocean, and the rigid airship program was shuttered.
So, wait, is it still underwater, like theoretically?
What remains of it, yeah.
Dude, how many jackets do you think are down there?
A few years later, the overextended U.S. Navy, now no longer having any type of airship support to help guard the Pacific, would be caught off guard by the Japanese as the December 7th attack on Pearl Harbor launched the United States fully into World War II. Many aviation and naval experts believe that if the Navy had not sabotaged their earlier scouting projects with rigid airships, that said ships could have preemptively seen the incoming Japanese fleet in the Pearl Harbor, and the more than 2,000 fatalities that suffered that day could have been avoided. Which now brings us to our first mention fully of World War II in a history series, and I think this is like our 10th episode, which is not an easy. World
Yeah.
War II is a big topic that's always looming overhead,
Yeah.
but we made it, and that is the story of the United States rigid airship program. What do you think?
It's just yet another cautionary tale, because so many times in like military historical stuff, you find the leaders were either absolutely insane
Mm-hmm.
or had something to prove, and because of that, they either wasted a whole bunch of money trying to make psychics,
Oh yeah, yeah.
or they drove these like how much did Zeppelin cost? Like it wasn't cheap.
It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't the same
The
cost as a naval carrier made fully of
Yeah,
metal.
but the helium alone is not cheap.
And or hydrogen, depending on the era.
Yeah, and aluminum I don't think was a refined process of making that, so that was probably not efficient
I
to
mean,
make.
they've been at that point. You've got a lot of construction and
But
buildings and stuff. So
but it's people trying to prove stuff either to shut down the program to make sure the program succeeds and lives are lost in the process, or you shut down the thing because you're like, haha, I did it. I've destroyed the person I don't like, or this thing that, made my boss upset, or whatever.
mhm.
And then 2,000 people die because the program that was made for a reason was gone.
So my question for you is, does this belong in a museum? Because I'd hate to have to call in Illinois Jackson and have him
It,
ask you.
it, I hate that character so much.
Character, he's the guy who's asking us to take care of his museum.
Uh, yes, and I would love to see, because, like, it's relatively easy for like a university to make a drone submersible.
Hmm.
I would love to go down and see what the ship currently looks like down there.
I would really like to see a movie based on
Like
this.
if I had Post Malone money, if I had that money, I would get I would have a jacket made out of the Zeppelin that's currently down there from,
From the Macon that crashed?
yeah. But yeah, I would have a jacket made from that material, or I would have
You
a
know what?
piece of it framed.
Maybe I'll try and find some type of similar canvas to what that is, and like we'll make some custom jackets to wear in the rain that look like they were made from like the Navy ship. Like maybe we'll stamp them with like Navy symbols and then cut them so they look
I
like.
am 100% down with that.
So, anyway, I thought this was a fascinating alternate look into what we almost did as far as travel, and this brings us into World War II, which brings us to our first World War II centric episode, which we will be doing next, which is about the insane mysticism that genuinely fueled the Nazis. It turns out they were phenomenally stupid people. Like, just the dumbest pseudo intellectual troglodytes
I
you
now,
will ever have heard of.
I now regret having said, well, if Hitler wasn't there, someone else would have done it, because maybe they wouldn't have been as crazy.
Oh, no, Hitler wasn't even the craziest person when it came to the mysticism. That would be the leader of the SS, but I'm not going to get ahead of myself.
Was his name Sammy Soldier? He named it
Heinrich
after.
Himmler.
That's an HH.
Anyway, thanks for watching.